This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
Additional support provided by
The secret to quality fermentation is White Labs. Core strains are made weekly and most can ship out the next day. Order through the White Labs app or yeastman.com. Visit whitelabs.com/whywhitelabs for a new customer special offer. That's whitelabs.com/WHY Whitelabs.
You know, the first brewery I worked at was a pub brewery in California from 1988 to 1992. It was called San Andreas, and Bill, the owner there, never wanted me to brew an IPA. He said his customers weren't ready for it. And, and obviously things have changed.
This week on the show, Mitch Steele talks about the evolution of IPA. We go all the way from IPA's early history to modern times and hear about some of Mitch's strategies for brewing IPA at New Realm. Mitch, there's very little that we know about early IPA. What do we know?
Well, we know that beer was being shipped to India from England on a pretty regular basis in the 1700s. And we know that there was a brewer at the Bow Brewery. His name was Hodgson, and he was shipping beer to India on a regular basis. And one of the beers that he was shipping was a pale ale. And the pale ale was what we think was the original IPA. And every beer that was shipped back then was dry hopped in the cask. So the whole idea of dry hopping in the cask and putting extra hops in for shipment was something that was done to virtually every beer at the time. The conventional wisdom is that Hodgson at Bow Brewery invented India Pale Ale specifically for shipping to India. And based on the evidence that a lot of beer historians have uncovered, we don't think that's the case. We think he was just shipping one of his standard beers, and it became very popular. And you can, some of the historians, Martin Cornell and Ron Pattinson and Pete Brown and some of these guys from England that have done some extensive research on this have learned and have found advertisements and press regarding this beer that was being shipped to India. And up until the mid 1830s, it was really just referred to as Hodgson's Pale Ale. It never was referred to as India Pale Ale until about 1835. There may have been one reference to it as India Pale Ale earlier than that, but really for 50 or 60 years that they were shipping this beer to India, it really was just called Pale Ale.
Yeah, it's funny, even though I guess your book, which I guess is maybe 7 or so years old now, kind of busted that myth. I still hear folks telling that story today about how, it was designed to survive the long trip around the Horn of Africa when all these other beers spoiled, but it sounds like that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, it seems like it was a more serendipitous kind of thing where he was shipping this beer and it had a lot of hops in it, and it just became the preferred beer in India. And when the Burton Brewers started getting involved in providing a little competition to Hodgson, I think that's when the term India Pale Ale really started coming about.
There's quite a bit more information available about IPA brewed during the Burton years, so we're talking roughly 1820 to 1900. Tell us about those beers.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of information documented on these beers, and the thing about the Bow Brewery and Hodgson's beer in the 1700s, early 1800s, is that brewery went out of business, and all the records, if they had records, are long gone. So you have to make guesses based on how people were describing the flavor in print and how they were pricing the beer. But with the Burton Brewers, Alsop and Salt and Bass, when they started brewing this beer and trying to emulate the Hodgson IPA, they kept good records, and I was able to go into the Burton Museum in Burton-on-Trent and actually look at some of the old recipe books. And I had some other documentation as well. So we know quite a bit about this beer, and it's really not a lot different than what we consider a West Coast IPA today. It's a very pale beer. It was very dry. It was fermented. It went through multiple seasons of fermentation to accentuate the dryness. The original gravity was, in the 16 to 17 Plato range, or 1065 to 1070 if you like specific gravity, and we believe it was about 70 IBUs. And so it really is, except for the ingredients, which were different back then, of course. It really is pretty similar to what a lot of brewers were brewing IPAs like over the last 10 to 15 years. We know the malt. The Burton Brewers put together or developed a process to kiln pale malt at a very low temperature to really reduce the color formation during the kilning process. East Kent Goldings were the preferred hops in India Pale Ale. It basically was the showcase beer for these breweries, so they tried to use the best ingredients they could. And of course, the Burton water is very hard with lots of calcium and sulfate, and so that's where the term Burtonizing water came from. Was from the characteristics of Burton water, and brewers in other locations trying to emulate that and replicate that water profile to get the hop bitterness to come through. We know how the beer was brewed because we know how all the beer was brewed back then through the records. I think the most interesting thing that I found out in doing the research for this is they would brew, these Burton Brewers would brew the beer in typically November, December timeframe, allow it to go through a primary fermentation, and then put it into casks and let it sit through the summer so that the fermentation started up again as the temperatures warmed up and really dried out the beer. And I think that was something that takes it into a different realm than what today's brewers are doing, where we all want to have really fresh hop character and we want to get it packaged while the hops are still really, really prominent and intense. And it was pretty much opposite that in the 1800s with the Burton beers.
That's interesting. And what kind of hop rate are we talking about? How many pounds per barrel were they actually using?
Oh, it was a lot. I mean, East Kent Goldings were very low alpha acids back then. I think most of the estimates are around 2 to 3% alpha acids. We have no way of knowing for sure, but they were hopping at 5 to 7 or 8 or even 9 pounds per barrel in the IPA, and that includes all the hopping. The hopping in the brew house and the hopping in the cask, and that's a lot of hops. Today's IPA brewers, I think I saw that the average hop use among craft brewers right now is at about 1.7 or 1.8 pounds per barrel. And I know there's a lot of brewers that are using 5 pounds per barrel in IPAs, especially the hazy IPA brewers. But really, that's an unreal amount of hops.
Yeah, it really is. So were those beers, also, again, the low alphas, but also I bet a lot of those hops were probably pretty oxidized too. Were those beers described as being very bitter?
Yes, they were. Hodgson's beer, when the Burton Brewers first tasted it, it was described as incredibly bitter and harsh. They were described as bitter, but not unpleasantly so.
Okay. How much of that dryness do you think came from hop creep? We've been talking about that a lot lately.
Yeah, that's a real good question, and actually, John from Steiner, who's got a really great presentation on New England IPAs, brought that up with me recently, and I don't know, hop creep wasn't, when I wrote the book, hop creep wasn't really something that had been identified yet. It's quite possible that a lot of it was from that. I do think a lot of it also came from the fact that the British yeast cultures had multiple strains in them, and more than likely we've got proof that these cultures often had Brettanomyces in them as well, which would also accentuate the dryness if during a secondary or tertiary fermentation.
Yeah, and you mentioned too, I think, that these beers were aged for a pretty long time. What was the main, besides getting them to dry out, what were the other main drivers behind that long aging process?
Oh, it was really all about drying it out, and it was so that the casks, when they were, or the barrels, I'll use casks and barrels interchangeably, but when the barrels were put on a boat, the brewers did not want to have any residual fermentable sugars in that beer at all, because the casks could explode. And so that was the one thing that any beer for shipping was aged for a very long time in oak barrels, just to make sure that everything fermentable had been fermented out.
Cool. Okay, you hear a lot about sort of like the party guile method during this time period. What was that all about? Why did that really, what did that really achieve?
Well, at the time they didn't, the whole sparging thing was kind of a new process. Sparging in the lauter tun was something that Scottish brewers developed at some point in the 1800s. And before then, what brewers would do is they would do multiple mashes, and so they would mash a batch of beer and collect the wort and boil it, and then with that grain they would add more liquid to it, more water, and mash it again and collect that, and they kept it all separate. And then what they could do is blend the worts together to get the beer that they want, and the only brewer that does that I'm really aware of now is Fuller's in London, and they are sparging their grain in the lauter, but in the lautering process, they use a mash lauter tun. But they do collect the wort into different vessels depending on the strength, and then blend them together to get their beers. So it's a very, very British process, and that's how most of the beers were made back then.
Okay, and it seems like these beers were always racked into casks before fermentation finished. Is that right?
Well, in Burton, they did the Burton Union system. So they would get the fermentation started in a large vessel and then put them into very big barrels or casks to finish the fermentation. And then they had these swan necks that came out of the wood barrels and into a trough up above to collect all the yeast. And that was how they got the yeast out of it.
So things started to change once we got into the 20th century. Why is that?
A lot of reasons. Politics, of course, played a pretty big role in what was going on. There was a temperance movement that developed in the 1800s and went into the early 1900s that was very, very influential. Obviously, it resulted in prohibition in the United States, and it resulted in a lowering of alcohol contents across the world. And that was one reason. Being high alcohol beers became less acceptable. People being drunk in public became less acceptable, and so that was one big piece of it. The other thing was the world wars, and World War I in particular really created huge grain shortages, and that's when brewers in England started using sugar on a more frequent basis. And they just brewed beers lighter, so they didn't have to use as many ingredients or as much malt in the beer. And taxation was part of this as well. Sin taxes and things like that, because of the temperance movements, were increasing. And in England, they were taxing on how much malted barley used in a batch of beer. That was how they based their tax structure, not on just volume like here in the United States. So, high alcohol beers in England are going to get taxed a lot higher than lower alcohol beers. And that's still the case today. And that's all a remnant of what happened in the early 1900s.
So did all of the IPAs of the previous era get dumbed down, or were there any that sort of remained as they were in their past?
I think in England they probably I would say if there's an exception, I don't know about it. I think all of them got lowered. In the United States, Ballantine's IPA before and after Prohibition, my understanding is it was pretty much the same beer.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you to talk about that beer next, because that was obviously an important brand in the history of American IPA. So talk about Ballantine's.
Yeah, Ballantine was probably the only traditional IPA that survived into the 1960s, and they ran a brewery that got bought and sold in the 60s during all the consolidations, but Ballantine's beer was pretty popular up until that point. And they were doing an IPA that really was very characteristic and very, very English. It was aged for a year in oak casks. They weren't barrels or 50-gallon barrels at that time. They were large, what we call fooders today. And there's pictures of those fooders in the book. At one of the breweries that was making it. I don't think it was Ballantine. I think it was Fegan or somebody else. But so they went through this year-long aging process, and then after Prohibition, they developed a method to distill hop oil and add that for the dry hop instead of adding whole hops into the tank during this year-long aging process. And so that was a really interesting thing. I think most people think the hop they were using was bouillon, and they were distilling it and creating an oil, and they would add that to the tank during the year-long aging process. But again, if you look at Ballantine IPA and what it was a light amber beer that had, close to 7% alcohol, 70 IBUs. And, by the time the 1950s and 1960s rolled around and this beer was still there, it was definitely unusual and unique, and nobody else was brewing anything like it, I don't think.
Do you know if that steam distillation was something that sort of evolved, or was that something they did out of the gate?
I think it was something that evolved, but I don't know for sure. I really wasn't able to uncover much or anything about that whole process. So I grabbed that information from some other articles that have been published about Ballantine IPA, but there really wasn't a lot of detail about the technology around it.
IPA today seems to mean a lot of different things. What did it mean in the early years of the craft revolution?
Oh, I think early in craft, IPA was a showcase for hops. And, I think most craft brewers in the 1980s, with a few exceptions, started off brewing English-style ales. And they would use, American hops in a lot of these beers. So it was really creating a new flavor profile for beer. But I remember in the late 80s tasting my first craft brewed IPA, and it was the hoppiest beer I'd ever had in my life, and it was so wild and so different from anything else that was being brewed. It was just incredible.
What was that? I was just going to ask you what the first really amazing IPA you remember drinking was.
This is a guess. I think it was Rubicon IPA out of Sacramento, and I remember drinking. The first time I had IPA was at a beer festival, and I think it was Rubicon, but I'm not positive. It might have been Anderson Valley. But, one of those early, mid to late 80s California microbrewers was who brewed the first one that I tried. And then, Liberty Ale had been brewed by Anchor Brewing out of San Francisco since the 1970s, but they never really called it an IPA. But if you look at the recipe, it was an IPA. And then, of course, Sierra Nevada Celebration Ale was one of the first ones as well. And both, Mark Carpenter at Anchor and Ken Grossman at Sierra Nevada both told me that their IPAs, those beers, were inspired by Ballantine. And Fritz Maytag and Ken Grossman are old enough to remember Ballantine in the 1960s and what it tasted like. I think early on with the 1980s and IPA brewing, I think the brewers, I believe, were using, some crystal malts in the beer. You had kind of a light amber or maybe medium amber beer with a lot of hop character, 60 to 70 IBUs, and a pound per barrel in the dry hop. And at the time, those were very intense hop characters to have in any sort of beer, and really it was a shock to the system. But the brewers loved it, and it's like, wow, it kind of evolved from the 1980s into the 1990s, where people started developing a taste for these really bitter beers and higher alcohol beers, and really hop forward beers. And so IPA just kind of, people kept brewing them, and more brewers started brewing them. In fact, the first brewery I worked at was a pub brewery in California. From 1988 to 1992. It was called San Andreas, and Bill, the owner there, never wanted me to brew an IPA. He said his customers weren't ready for it. and obviously things have changed. But I think we could have pulled it off. I did ask him often, if I could throw an IPA onto the schedule, and he just really wasn't willing to go there. By the mid-1990s, there were a lot of brewers brewing IPA. And, one of the first ones in the 80s that was actually called IPA and put into a package was Burt Grant's IPA out of Washington State. And most people believe that was the very first craft beer that was actually labeled as an IPA. But by the 1990s, a lot of brewers were making them.
Coming up,
if you put in another batch of beer into that fermenter, and there's still some residual enzyme hanging out in some gasket material, you can get a drier beer than what you want. And I learned that the hard way.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Bring the world to your brewhouse with BSG's diverse selection of ingredients and services. Our dedicated customer service team and industry experience provides you with the assistance you need every step of the way. Make BSG your supplier of choice with products essential to making great artisanal beverages so you can stay focused on your craft. Visit us at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact us at 1-800-374-2739.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. Don't miss the CO2 monitoring in the Brewery and Brewpub webinar June 13th. District Philly's annual golf outing is June 14th. District Midwest meets at Wolf's Ridge Brewing in Columbus June 29th. Don't miss the July 10th safety webinar, Lockout, Tagout, It's the Law. The District Michigan Summer Social is July 13th at Fitzgerald Park in Grand Ledge. District St. Paul, Minneapolis joins forces with the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild once again for the Minnesota Brewers Conference July 26th in Duluth. The District Texas Summer Meeting in Kerrville is the weekend of August 2nd. Master Brewers Brewery Systems Technology and Maintenance course starts August 18th in Madison. And the District Ontario Hop Field Day is August 24th at Goodlot Farmstead Brewing Company. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full calendar of events at MBAA.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. It's becoming more difficult to find just a normal 1990s IPA these days. What do you think is key when brewing standard American IPAs the old way?
Well, the old way, I would use C hops. I would use Centennial, Cascade, Chinook, maybe Columbus. I think that's that's kind of what characterized those early IPAs. And then, using crystal malt, which kind of went away as the West Coast IPA in the late 90s and early 2000s came into prominence, using 10% crystal malt and give it some malt balance is something that a lot of brewers did back then. It's funny, because I know a lot of brewers that are doing now brewing old guard or old school IPAs and kind of going back to those recipes just to have something different on their tap list. But it's kind of cool to see that people are getting back into that. Another interesting hop that never was really used back then but has similar characteristics is Comet, which is kind of getting a little popularity right now with craft brewers. So I think the big thing, 6 to 7% alcohol, 60 to 70 IBUs, and a lot of C hops. Maybe a pound and a half per barrel in the dry hop.
Yeah, not over the top, right?
Not over the top, but you have a lot more balance in the early ones.
Yeah. And then in true American fashion, we had to keep making IPA bigger, right?
Right. So, that we call that the hops arms race and the bitterness arms race. But when brewers like Pizza Port and Vinnie Cilurzo at Blind Pig and then a little bit later on Stone started brewing IPAs, they created an IPA style that was a little bit different, and it was characterized much more by having a very dry finish, very little crystal malt. If they used crystal malt, it was a lightly colored crystal malt, not C40, but maybe C15, and just going 5%, 7%, and something like that. Bumping up the IBU levels so that they were routinely over 70, bumping up the dry hop levels so they were, a pound and a half above. So a little bit more hop focused, drier, more bitter. And the nice thing about that style, and I still love that style, is that when you drink it and it's bitter like that, if the bitterness isn't harsh, it makes it a very pleasant drink that you actually want. It prompts you to drink more. It kind of dries out your palate, and then you want to take more because you get thirsty. The hard thing about those beers is if you don't nail the hop bitterness, and it becomes very harsh, and that's not pleasant at all. But I think the brewers I mentioned and a lot of the new IPAs that came out in the early 2000s were classic, what I would consider classic West Coast IPAs.
Next came the Belgian IPAs. I'd actually forgotten about those. That style had a lot of momentum, maybe not quite 10 years ago, and then sort of faded away.
Yeah, exactly. Belgian IPAs are a tough one. There were two approaches that I knew that brewers did, and when I was at Stone, we did both of them. One was to make IPA wort and ferment it with Belgian yeast, and that was pretty easy. And the other was to make something like a Belgian triple and then hop it like an IPA. And both methods worked. I tended to prefer the ones that were formulated like a triple a little bit better. I thought they were a little more elegant. But when you get a Belgian beer and you get those clove and banana type flavors being produced, you run the risk of the hops clashing with the yeast character, and I think that's what most people had a hard time with Belgian IPAs. And I just hoppy Belgian beers are wonderful, but if you call it a Belgian IPA, I don't think people gravitate towards that. And so they kind of came and went.
Yeah. And then the same can kind of be said for both black and white IPA. You don't see those styles all that often anymore either.
No, you really don't. And I didn't think the white IPA really had a lot of legs originally. There were only a few brewers that made it. It was a last-minute addition to my book because it had just started happening right when we were going through the editing process. And so I quickly did a little research and made a couple phone calls and got the scoop on how people were brewing those. But black IPAs, that was one of my favorite beers we did at Stone, was the Sublimely Self-Righteous Ale, which was a black IPA. It was originally Stone's 11th anniversary beer. And I thought that was going to have a little more staying power. But in the end, I think what really killed that was the oxymoron of black and India Pale Ale, which, you can't, how can you have a black pale ale? Well, and my argument always was, well, if you call it an IPA, you know what you're getting. If you call it a black IPA, you know exactly what you're getting. You're getting a really hoppy beer that's black in color. And so to me, I never had a problem with calling it a black IPA. And then, there were a bunch of folks that wanted to call it Cascadian Dark, which to me is even more confusing than black IPA. So I think the whole naming convention for that beer really, really threw that style out of contention. And the Brewers Association still recognizes it as American Black Ale, which is fine. But you're right, not many people are brewing it anymore.
Then my favorite, because I like to drink several beers and still be able to stand up, Session IPA. Do you think that style will stick around?
Yeah, actually I do. I think Session IPAs and lower alcohol beers are something that are going to stick around for a while. I think, the hard thing with brewing a Session IPA is getting a good balance with the hopping and not making it taste like a hop tea. But I think people in general, and certainly we see this at New Realm, and we see it, in the national statistics and the economists and beer guys that research this stuff, that lower alcohol beers are becoming pretty popular among beer drinkers, and so I think Session IPA is going to stick around for a while.
What's important to you when you're brewing a Session IPA? I mean, you already talked about sort of the balance and stuff, but I mean, what are some key strategies there?
Well, for me, it was always trying to make a beer that doesn't taste like it has low alcohol, and so I didn't want it to taste thin and watery, and so what I always tried to do was get enough body in there to put a little balance in it. I didn't want it to be sweet, but I wanted it to have enough malt character and enough body that the hops, if you hopped it like a regular IPA, that the hops would be prominent but not be overdone. And and we tried a lot of different things with Session IPAs to try and do that. We tried crystal malts and then pulled them out. Munich malt works really well. Things like Carafoam or Carapils, the dextrin malts work pretty well in those styles. And then, keeping the hopping a little tame, as opposed to a regular IPA. Don't target 70 IBUs in something that's only 4.5% alcohol, maybe 50 to 60, which a lot of regular IPAs are kind of targeting that level of IBUs now anyway. So you're not overdoing it with that kind of an IBU level. But, and then we always approached the dry hopping. We went pretty aggressive on the dry hopping, but not so much to overwhelm any of the malt character or the body of the beer.
We're going to talk about some of the newer trends in IPA in a minute, but before we do that, I'm curious, why do you think IPA became such a large share of craft beer over the last 10 or so years?
Very good question. I think, number one, I think it was fueled by brewers, and brewers are the biggest beer fans in the world. And I think brewers really took to the style, and it became kind of a bragging rights kind of thing with some of the IPAs. And I think people in general, just over the years, have become accustomed to and educated about the taste of hops in a beer. And, and so I think people have gone from, turning their nose up at a bitter beer to really appreciating all the flavors that can come from hops. And I think that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've also wondered if it's not, if this wouldn't be a factor too, because, I remember going to a lot of, let's face it, craft beer has gotten a lot better in the last decade or so, right? I mean, there's always, some bad beers out there, but I think odds of getting a good one are greatly, have greatly improved than they were in, say, the 90s and whatnot. And, I have to wonder, if you go to a brew pub and the beer's kind of mediocre at best, usually the IPA is going to be the one that you can really stomach because, a little hops and alcohol are going to cover up some mistakes, right? So
yeah.
I have to wonder if people didn't sort of, develop a taste for IPA because it was the most palatable out of what was around.
Yeah, probably the safest choice, wasn't it?
Right. So, anyway. Obviously, we're in the thick of the haze craze. Dr. May told us all about New England IPA on episode 104, but I feel like there's already been a lot of evolution within that style in a fairly short period of time. Some of these beers are pretty different from the ones that created the category, aren't they?
I believe so, yes, and I am certainly not an expert on brewing this style of beer. We've done a few now, and I'm learning as I go. But it's interesting. I think the biggest thing. And I'll tell this story. I was at the Craft Brewers Conference last week and talking with another brewer from a very well-known brewery, and I mentioned that we had brewed a hazy IPA, and it was doing really well for us. And I made the comment that we got the hop character that we were looking for, the flavor, the juiciness, and all that, but we're still struggling with the haze. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are putting a lot of effort into trying to understand how to maintain a stable haze in these beers. And so a lot of the ones that have come out recently that are going into bottles or cans and are on the shelves for a while, they're not quite as hazy as the original ones, I don't think. And, it's because, those original hazy IPAs and the ones that are still being brewed up in New England, they put those in a can and then they put it out on their website that they're going to sell them, and people line up for hours and pick this beer up, and they turn these beers over in a matter of a week. And so if it's really hazy, the haze doesn't have a chance to settle out into kind of a thick mass at the bottom of the package. And but now that brewers are going through regular channels and through distribution to sell these beers, the stability of the haze is becoming a lot more important.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know you said you're kind of new to the style, but what's been important to you so far? What have been key strategies for brewing the ones you've done so far?
Yeah, here's what we've learned. Number one, the yeast strain is very important. We have tried several. Our house ale strain is California ale yeast. That doesn't do it. That does not get the biotransformation that you want. London Ale 3 or the Vermont yeast are the two best that I've seen. I know there's some other ones out there. I saw a presentation last week that indicated that there's a Kolsch yeast that does really well with biotransformation. You need to have the hops pretty early in the fermentation to really get the biotransformation going, and the biotransformation chemistry is still being studied, and what is going on there, and which compounds are being acted on by enzymes, and what are the resulting flavors? Are they thiols? Are they terpenes? What are they? It looks like it's a combination of everything. But the hop strain is really important as well. The hop variety, rather, is really important. And certain hop varieties lend themselves better to doing hazies and getting that juicy character. We use El Dorado in ours and Azaka, and those are both great hops for this. And I've heard Idaho 7 is a great hop for biotransformation. I've heard Citra is not a great hop. So those are the kind of things that you talk about with other brewers and you learn. And then so you need the early fermentation addition to really get the biotransformation, get that juicy character. And I remember the first time we brewed one, and we added the hops at 24 hours into the fermentation, and then at 48 hours, and we taste our beer every day. At 48 hours, that beer had just gone from hop resin to orange juice, and it was amazing to see that happen and just kind of realize that it really worked. And then, following it with an additional dry hop, one of the things that we learned is you got to be careful with that second dry hop if you do it post-fermentation, because you could cover up all your juiciness by using too many hops in the second dry hop. So, that's those are the kind of things that we've learned. The haze, everybody's that's brewing these beers is using oats, using wheat malt. I think where the wheat malt comes from might be important. I haven't been able to prove that yet, but I'm hearing that American wheat malt might be better suited for hazy IPAs than European wheat malt. I don't know. So there's a lot to learn still, and now there's people that are really taking a scientific approach to this, and there's new stuff coming out all the time.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I was going to ask you about, when you talk about dry hopping during active fermentation, what do you think? What are your thoughts on sort of the balance between, one school of thought is you want to get the hops in, as early as possible to maximize biotransformation. The other concern is if you get them in there too soon, you're going to have a lot of CO2 stripping. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't see a lot of that really. I don't see any degradation of the hop character after day one. It just changes, and maybe the stripping happens early, and so we just don't see it. But I'm not overly concerned with it, to be honest.
How about managing yeast in that scenario, which is obviously a nightmare? How are you attacking that?
Yeah, that's a huge issue, and that's one I hope somebody finds a solution for. Honestly, when you add the hops in the middle of fermentation, your yeast is ruined. You can't. I know there are some people that are repitching it, but boy, it is bitter, it is harsh, and the viability is really low. At least what we've seen, and so we don't repitch typically from a New England IPA fermentation, and because we're not using our house yeast in that, it's created a very high cost for brewing this beer because we have to get fresh yeast every time. If you have a propagation system and can grow yeast, you can save a lot of money by buying a smaller pitch and growing your yeast and then adding it to the beer. But we haven't found a way to repitch off hazy IPA fermentations, and that's a real problem.
Yeah. Cool. And I'm glad you talked about yeast selection too, because I think that especially at the consumer level, these, the hops get all the attention in these beers, but, these flavors in these beers are very yeast driven. And so I think that yeast selection is incredibly important. And I've made some interesting ones with old school hops, with C hops, and still gotten a lot of the stone fruit and those interesting flavors if you use the right yeast strain. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, well, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about one of the latest trends, which is brewed IPA. A good bit of Sierra Nevada's version has been cycling through my beer fridge lately. Talk about where this style came from.
So brewed IPA, we think, was created by Kim Sturdivant at the Social Kitchen and Brewery in San Francisco. That's the documentation. And apparently he was using amyloglucosidase enzyme in some of his imperial stouts and decided to try it in an IPA. And, the first ones, and I've talked with people at Drake's out in the Bay Area about how they brew it, because they brew a lot of these. There's, it's a beer that's incredibly dry, and as opposed to maybe the medium bodied and sweet New England IPAs, maybe this is a reaction to that and going in the opposite direction. But the idea of adding enzyme to a craft beer is something that really wasn't thought about a lot until very recently. Enzymes were always kind of the realm of big brewers, and doing the low carb beers and the low cal beers and the ultralights and all that kind of thing. And so the idea of using enzyme in a craft beer to break down every dextrin into glucose was kind of cool. And I was intrigued by the style when I first heard about it, and so it was just about a year ago, and I was talking to some of the brewers at Drake's about it, and we've brewed 5 or 6 of them now, and have had a lot of fun with them. I think, a couple of things that I've learned about brewing a good brut IPA is, number one, you got to drop the IBUs from a regular IPA. We found that 25 to 35 is about the sweet spot for bitterness. Otherwise, because it's so dry, it's unbalanced. It's too bitter. A lot of the brewers started using European hops in these to try and get kind of a wine-like character. I've moved away from that. I've kind of gone into using Cascades and some of the newer hop varieties in it. Like we did one with Sabra, we did one with Strata, and that was a great thing. I think the biggest challenge with brewing these beers is getting the dryness, especially you're going to get the dryness if you add the enzyme in the fermenter, and that's how these beers started to be brewed. The problem with that and the risk with that is that enzyme, if you don't get it out of the fermenter, can impact the next batch of beer that goes in there. And so it's a real problem. If you put in another batch of beer into that fermenter, and there's still some residual enzyme hanging out in some gasket material, you can get a drier beer than what you want. And I learned that the hard way. We had a strip cleaning process that wasn't quite followed when we did our one of our first brewed IPAs, and the next beer that went in there finished at about 1 degree Plato when it should have finished at about 4. So
wow.
Yeah, so it's a real risk. And so we've done a lot of work recently just trying to get the enzymatic activity all done in the brew house prior to the boil, and then you can denature the enzyme in the boil.
Do you want to talk about the impact of other impacts from adding enzymes in like late fermentation versus early? I mean, obviously there's going to be some ester implications there too as well, right?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've seen with adding the enzyme late is it really messes up the yeast. And, if you look at how yeast consumes the sugars in wort, yeast will always go for the lowest hanging fruit first. They're going for the glucose and the fructose, or, whatever sugars are in there, the less complex sugars first, and then they kind of transition into metabolizing things like maltose. And so if you add the enzyme too late and the yeast are already fully conditioned to be breaking down maltose and fermenting that, they get thrown into a bit of a tizzy and start throwing a lot of diacetyl. And that's what we saw. If we add the enzyme day 1 of fermentation, we're fine. But if we add it like day 3 or day 4, when you're 1 or 2 degrees Plato above terminal gravity, the yeast gets really stressed out and throws a lot of diacetyl. And it takes a long time for that diacetyl to be reconsumed and reduced. And that's the biggest difference I've seen.
Yeah. Okay. How about yeast selection for brewed IPAs?
We've just used our standard yeast. I know there are people that are using champagne yeast. I haven't tried that yet. I've seen people use Belgian yeast in these. But yeah, we just use our standard ale yeast and it's Cal ale yeast, and it works fine.
Cool. Okay, generally speaking, how has your dry hopping strategy evolved over the years, and what do you want to try next?
My dry hopping over the years, I think, like a lot of brewers, my addition rates have gone up. I remember when a 1/4 pound per barrel was considered a lot. And then when I got to Stone, 1.5 pounds per barrel was considered a lot back in 2006. And now there are so many brewers that won't dry hop with anything less than 2 pounds per barrel. So I think using more hops is probably the biggest change that I've seen over the years. The other thing, I like to blend hops, and I'm not a big single hop guy, and this is something that I continue to do now, and really look for nice ways to make the hops very complex in a beer. And so I try not to do a lot of single hop dry hopping in my beers, and that's just a personal preference. And there's a practical reason as well. If one of the hops changes in a crop year, or you can't get as much of it, you can make transitions without completely altering the taste of the beer, and keep it close to the original hop profile. So those are the things that I tend to look at with dry hopping. I am interested very much in some of the new varieties that are coming out. The experimental programs are going crazy. A lot of new stuff coming out, and just getting new flavors, out of hops. Some of the experimental hops now are producing a lot of coconut flavors and a lot of kind of oaky vanilla kind of character, and orange cream and strawberry. And, to me, that's the fun part of brewing, is getting some of those hops in and trying them out.
I think I was at the same booth you were at CBC trying some different beers. That was Mitch Steele here on the Master Brewers Podcast. If you haven't already read it, check out Mitch's book, IPA, Brewing Techniques, Recipes, and the Evolution of India Pale Ale. I'll put a link in the show notes, or you can pick up a copy from the Master Brewers bookstore at mbaa.com/store. Are you enjoying the Master Brewers podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, White Labs, and BSG. So please let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers podcast and that you appreciate their support.
And I hit on the ground.
It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. You can find all the details on the meetings tab at MBAA.com.
My fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much, and then I'm heading out to any other place. My fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much,